Delighted today to be speaking to Michelle Ryan, who's Commercial Director at True here in Jersey. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, thanks. Nice to see you.
So wonderful to talk to you today. You've been a long-term supporter of PCD and been along to our events over many years. Many people remember you from your banking days, and it'd be great to hear a little bit more about your role now at True and what you're focusing on.
I think it's funny, isn't it? Those iterations through the different banking days, my Coots days, and then moving back to Jersey, Climate Hambros days. It's funny when you think about how long it's been and how brilliant I found the club over the years, actually. And as we've moved, as I've segued into kind of this adjacent type of business, what's brilliant about this job is I'm still talking to a lot of the same people.
Right.
Same people, just slightly different hint. So James and I set up the business 2 years ago now, which has gone in the blink of an eye, because we constantly had questions from clients. We were constantly being asked by trustees, by lawyers, accountants, and private clients about sustainability. About 50% of my meetings had a sustainability question in it, and I just didn't have a good answer. Where I was, I didn't have a good answer around either internal sustainability or the solutions that I could offer. And it was frustrating for clients because they had no way to measure, they had no visibility of solutions, no way to compare. So James and I set the firm up originally to just look at ESG reporting. So it was to provide this answer from a risk perspective. So for every client, ESG data is relevant from a risk perspective, i.e. how are the companies that you're invested in managed, and that gives you some hint at what they might be, might perform like in the future. So even just that risk aspect. But the more clients were asking about this from having a preference or having a view on this and wanted to enact their ethics and morals through their portfolios, the more we felt they needed to be able to see things like green revenues, controversies, business involvement, and actually be able to compare portfolio to portfolio. And for trustees, of course, it's a big risk issue because there's this entire set of data that has been invisible to them when it comes to the risk of their portfolios.
So you definitely see the demand coming from clients. There's sometimes some debate about whether it's a supply issue, whether it's banks saying, oh, we need to be supplying something on the ESG and sustainable side, but you definitely see it as something that clients are demanding and the industry is having to respond. Yeah,
definitely. Particularly, I think we all know this data, female clients and younger clients. And actually it ties in really well for female clients and younger clients because sometimes, particularly if you're moving into an impact portfolio, so we're not talking about giving up financial returns, we're just looking at achieving other things with that money at the same time, answering the world's problems. Those tend to be long-term portfolios. They need to be, by their nature, longer term. And if we can drive the entire industry down a longer term vision, which should be your view with equities anyway, if we can drive everybody down longer term thinking and away from quarterly reporting, quarterly profit making statements that seem to be the focus of everything, that becomes more sustainable anyway because it means that people can make better decisions without having to worry about this short term deadline. So yeah, definitely client need.
So if you could just break down the types of clients you work with, I imagine there's many different types of professionals you could work with. Trustees, both here in Jersey and in other jurisdictions, tax and legal advisors, banks and wealth managers, who all have a slightly different angle on this conversation. How do you see that playing out in terms of the different services you can provide?
It's funny, in my banking role, I spoke to a lot of these people anyway, so a lot of that is the connections, that I speak to at PCD Club. A lot of those people had already been asking the questions because their clients were asking them. And being able to give them visibility, our firm belief is that often what stymies progress in this space, and kind of addressing your previous question about where's the demand coming from, what stymies progress is lack of information. Trustees can't have a good conversation with their client because they're talking about something that they have no visibility of. And that makes them worried about having the conversation with their client. So unless their client is saying, I very much have this agenda, it's very difficult to initiate the conversation without data. So if we are giving them that data, so that applies to trustees, it applies to lawyers and accountants who are getting those questions from clients around, how do I do this? How do I approach this? How do I look at what I've currently got and make a different decision? Pensions, for example, you and I, one of the things that everybody can do is look at their pension and the decisions that they make within their pension. It's really hard to know if you need to make a different decision if you don't know where you currently stand. So that's what we've kind of set out to achieve with the the ESG reporting and the portfolio monitoring, giving people that vision of where they currently stand. And oftentimes it's then a case of going to their asset manager and saying, okay, I didn't realise this. Can we talk about this? Can we make a different decision? This isn't about moving portfolios to somebody else. This is about engaging clients, end clients as well as their advisors, in the discussion around ESG in the same way that they would have the discussion about risk and performance. It's just giving them some more meaningful information.
Do you think also retail investors can drive change, not just the sort of high net worth with very bespoke portfolios? We see now reported more commonly in the press about people wanting to put pension pots into more sustainable vehicles. Do you have engagement with the platform providers, for example, where their underlying investors are trying to, ascertain sustainable and ESG portfolios, not just at the high net worth level, actually at more of an everyday level?
That defined contribution population is a tricky one to grip onto, because the way that the platform providers, the big platform providers, do that is that it's often their own, if it's often their own funds, or they're getting a kickback from those funds. So accessing that way is difficult. The way sometimes to access that is through the corporates. So we also do carbon footprinting and sustainability consulting, including for the trust companies, the law firms, et cetera, on their own sustainability agendas. And one of the things that you can look at from that perspective is, how are they managing their defined benefit money? How are they giving options on their defined contribution pension pots? And if you're talking to, and this is all staff in all of those industries, if you're saying to them, why don't you make the default, we all have a lifestyle option on pensions, make the default a sustainable solution, or at least do no harm. It's a do no harm solution. That's the default. People have to opt out. And I can almost guarantee you no one's going to opt out of the do no harm into a do more harm.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, people want to do good. They want to do a good thing with their money. They just don't always know how. They don't always have the option. So if we can be getting corporates as a part of their total sustainability agenda to change the way they think about pensions and to change the options they have within their pensions, that actually then gets into your retail client that way.
And just in terms of how a professional services firm might look at its own sustainability position, what sort of things might they analyse in their overall business, and where can they make improvements? What do you see of a trust company or a bank, and how they look at their own business and how they can improve it?
Sometimes the really difficult place is exactly what you say, knowing where to start.
Yeah.
We often have clients come to us and they say, I don't know where to start. We're doing some things, some of the obvious things, like we've got rid of plastic cups, we have water fountains, we're encouraging lower paper use, thinking about what we buy and where we buy it from. So a lot of the time they're doing a lot of the doing, they're just not measuring. And sometimes they don't really know what to measure, other than the obvious one's carbon footprint. And that, I think, is where people come to us often as a gateway. That's the thing they want to start dealing with first. They don't realise, particularly in well-governed jurisdictions like ours, they're already probably doing some other things from a sustainability perspective, usually around diversity and inclusion, human rights, labour rights. They're looking at their supply chains maybe. So often they're already doing things. What they need is to coalesce that into a single strategy. Sometimes what people come to me and say is, I need an ESG strategy, or I need a sustainability strategy. And what we often say is, what you actually need to do is just think about your business strategy and being a sustainable business. It's not a bolt-on, it's not a thing you put on the side. It can kind of wrap around your full business, and you're probably already doing some of these things. Let's just coalesce that into something coherent, something that your employees and stakeholders generally can buy into and concentrate on and focus on.
So it's not a gimmick or a veneer, it has to be just integrated into the business, and ultimately it's just good long-term business, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than people looking at it as an overlay, it's got to be more fundamental.
And it's funny, we often have these conversations with people because, of course, if you think about the environmental and the carbon footprint, if you're being more efficient, you're using less resources, you're turning everything off and using less electricity, you're using less water, all of that's great for your carbon footprint and great for the environment. But of course, what else are you obviously doing? You're saving money. All of these things are actually saving. There's an economic interest in this to save your business money. It improves profitability. So even at a very basic level, you're looking at improving profitability by doing some of these things, which every board and every shareholder, every stakeholder can get on board with that quite easily. That's usually the easy one. It's when then you need to spend money to make money that there's sometimes more resistance. Sometimes, not often, not always. And I think boards are very much on this agenda now about long-term viability of the business. I think that's a really good change that we've seen here in Jersey recently. And in London, in fact, big partnerships in London we're talking to are all kind of pulling together around a sustainable way of doing business, even interestingly about the type of clients that they deal with. Brilliant conversation. We were talking to PKF BBA at their network, and they were talking about, here's our line in the sand, we don't deal with these types of clients.
What's your take on staying invested in some of these companies as they make the transition, rather than a kind of mass exit? If people stop providing services to these businesses who are on a longer term path towards making a transition, it's a complex debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I mean, what's your take on that?
I think do your due diligence. I think you talked about a veneer.
Yeah.
A veneer. It's very easy to have a veneer. You know, you have the right website and the right marketing campaign, you can have a veneer of sustainability. I think if firms are looking to do business with a new client or even reviewing an existing client, actually doing an impact study on that particular firm, to help the firm change. So if it comes out that the firm is really trying to do something, sometimes it's that they don't know what they should be recording or measuring, they don't know what policies they should have in place, they don't know how to take this to the next level to improve their impact. So getting an impact assessment can take them in that direction. Or it can be that actually getting under and into the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts, you might find that even though they've got a good talk about making change, they're not actually changing anything. And an example would be you've got an energy firm and they say they're spending 20 million on developing renewables, and actually when you look on that number might sound amazing, but you look under the surface and they're actually spending 200 million on exploring new fossil fuels. It's a bit of a veneer. Whereas you will have, it's hard with a coal mine or something like that, but if you do have energy companies who are really focused on that sustainability journey of looking at how they can be a solution as opposed to part of the problem, and today they may still be part of the problem, but they're really focused on being part of the solution, you should definitely stay invested. And I know a lot of my asset management clients would say investor activism, shareholder activism is a lot of the way that you can push the dial on this. So joining the stakeholder groups, proxy voting groups, in order to drive change in some of these companies is actually a much more effective way of getting change than just divesting and walking away. And there'll always be a point in which you maybe have to say, look, we're ethically opposed to what you're doing here and we're just going to have to leave. But you'd hope it wouldn't get that far. You'd hope with good boards and potentially voting in good boards, maybe that's the other answer, isn't it? Voting in different people and having a good board that wants to transition a business. Watch this space, I think. The next 5 to 10 years is going to be really interesting in that space.
Very interesting. And a lot of the discussions, the webinars that I've seen around this area, people get onto the whole area of measurement and data and then start just querying, the reliability of data, what does it mean? Do you think that's really a bit of a let-off, for those who are not making this transition into a more sustainable style because they say, the data, we don't know? What's your take on the measurement and data discussion?
I agree with you, cop-out. It's a cop-out. Saying that the data isn't perfect is a cop-out. We all rely on credit ratings, right? We all rely on credit ratings when we're looking at bonds, and any bond investor out there will talk about the credit ratings and is it AAA or whatever. But we all know they're not perfect. We come to rely on them partly, and we do our own due diligence, but we all accept that they're not a perfect science. And you can have a AA bond that all of a sudden becomes, something happens, big controversy, and it plummets in terms of credit rating. The same applies to any kind of ESG data. Something could be imperfect, something might not be right, but the whole lot isn't incorrect. And people often, I get the argument about there is no, you can get one ratings agency will give you one score and another will give you a different score, and they're not, they have different methodologies, But if it's very unlikely that you'll get AAA with one and a CCC with another. So they're not perfectly positively correlated, that's true, but they are still positively correlated in general terms. And so I think this answer that, the data's not perfect, we're just going to kick that can down the road because, I'd actually rather people did something even if they weren't measuring. I've got clients who come to me, like I said, who are doing loads of things, loads of really cool things. One of our clients is Jersey Water, and they've got huge plans, and we were talking about Ports of Jersey earlier, really cool things that they're all doing. And at the moment, they don't have a baseline measurement. They don't have a measure that says this is where you started, but they're doing stuff anyway. They're not waiting for the data and relying on just data because they're doing it because they genuinely want to be sustainable, not because they want to tell someone that they're sustainable. And I think that is the big difference. The people who are waiting for perfect data really just want to make a good show of it and tell people that they're super sustainable, maybe actually without doing too much about it. And so the clients that we work with, the way that we do, particularly carbon footprinting, for example, a measure is about a third of the system. Most of it is about set ambitions, set targets, set your sustainability goals, take action. And so it's not just measuring for the sake of measuring is pointless. And I think that's what we've seen. So to be a UK listed business, you've had to measure for a long time your carbon footprint. And because they're in the habit of measuring, a lot of the bigger companies, the bigger listed companies, if you ask them here, if you asked a lot of the banks here, a lot of the staff in the banks here, what's the carbon footprint of your business and what you're doing to mitigate it, a lot of them wouldn't have an answer. They wouldn't know because it's been being measured for years. You can go into their annual accounts and find that information, but it's measuring for the sake of measuring. The staff aren't engaged with a programme of reducing and getting anywhere near carbon neutral or net zero. And so I think I would much rather work with firms who aren't measuring and who on the surface aren't particularly sustainable, but actually are doing, lots of doing. And we work with a good number of those who are just on their journey now, making those decisions as they go. Much more exciting.
And what do you think about the political will also to do things? I mean, last year we had COP26. I mean, we're here in Jersey. The government has initiatives here. I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, businesses are responsible for the things they can control, but how do you see the broader policy environment in this field?
I think you've just hit the nail on the head with what you said there, COP26. Well, 26. There's been 26 COPs. We're still seeing very little progress. I think COP26 was interesting in that it asked everyone to review their nationally defined contributions. I think that was a really good pressure point, because they basically said, even if you all do the things that you said you're going to do, and we can set that aside as whether or not you believe that's going to happen, but even if we all do the things that we said we're going to do and cut the way we said we're going to cut, we're already at 2.5 degrees of warming by the end of the year. I think they adjusted that down with the ones that went into COP, the new nationally defined contributions. They adjusted that down to, I think it was 2.1, something like that. So we're still quite away from 1.5 degrees, which is what we're aiming for, maximum what we're aiming for. And so that, I think, was great, because it's sending everyone back and saying, go do your homework, come back to Sharm el-Sheikh at the end of this year with a new nationally defined contribution that cuts even further. I think what's been really telling is the Ukraine war. And what that's done for people's concept of energy security, where they buy their energy from, how quickly we need to make this transition. And governments aren't looking at it from a sustainability perspective, but of course the output might be more sustainable electrical generation.
Through necessity.
Through necessity. So I think that is an interesting, it shows when the right pressure is applied. Sadly, it shows the type of pressure that needs to be applied, as opposed to it being, because it's the right thing to do for the world, a little bit more self-interested. We've got a power shortage and we better do something about that. So it's a shame that it takes a different type of pressure as opposed to just doing the right thing. But I think there is some movement in that regard. Here in Jersey, we were about to have a general election, and it's funny how much pressure there has been from the population asking about climate change particularly, but sustainability overall. So things like our Minister for the Environment was also the Minister for Planning. And I think that's a huge conflict of interest. And so I think there's a recognition that that needs to change even. Jersey just became a party. So through COP26 and all the UK's commitments, we've just become a party to those, including a party to the Paris Accord. So we've sort of got a seat at the table, which we never had before. It's really exciting. We've got a carbon neutral roadmap here. A bit sad that that the net zero target is 2050. I think the population would like to see that happen a bit sooner. But it's in keeping with Paris. It is moving in that direction of cutting in half by 2030. This decade of action, it's called. I think it's terribly exciting that we started our business at the start of the decade of action, and I'll be really keen to see what that journey looks like over this 10 years of really important time. But yeah, the political will does seem to be there. We've seen a number of candidates standing on an environmental pillar here, which is great. But I do think businesses have much more capacity to move more quickly. The businesses that we talk to,
they're the drivers of the economy,
and moving much more, and looking at their scope 3, which I think is really interesting. Carbon is divided into scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 and 2 is where nations look at territorially what happens within our borders, like where does our electricity come from, what are we combusting on island effectively, and that's what they focus on. Businesses are actually really focused on this scope 3, which is our supply chain. So where do we get stuff from? What services do we buy? Where are we travelling to? All the stuff that's up and down their supply chain that's potentially not here on island is really meaningful, because for a service-led island, and any of yours businesses are really service-led, they're not making widgets, they're providing services, the biggest impact we can all have is beyond our own borders. You think about the finance industries and all of the places that you visit, the biggest power that they've got isn't just looking at those companies and their own sustainability, which is 500 employees or whatever. It's looking at, okay, but we actually advise billions of pounds worth of clients, and we deploy billions of pounds worth of finance into the world. What can we do? And punching way above. Finance industry actors can punch way above their weight in that perspective by trying to make their supply chains and their advice more sustainable.
Very interesting. Do you think across the ESG spectrum, the environmental aspects are easier to kind of get consensus around? Do they get more attention? Are there parts of the ESG spectrum that you'd like to see more focus on, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think for good reason. I mean, it's a climate emergency for a reason. So I think people are pegging a lot of their strategy around carbon or carbon equivalents, and sometimes forgetting the other things. I think in well-governed jurisdictions like ours, things like, we've got robust anti-discrimination laws, diversity and, diverse, generally reasonably diverse and inclusive population, and we can argue the nuance within that. There is nuance within that. But generally speaking, I have as much ability to get a job as you do. For example, I'm not precluded from driving or working, for example. So generally speaking, some of the social pillars are hit anyway. But sometimes people think having a policy is enough. Culture is actually really important. And so you can have a really good D&I policy, but a terribly, terrible lack of inclusion within your culture as an organisation. And so one of the things we really believe in is measuring impact, not intention. Part of the problem with a lot of the schemes, even B Corp, is a lot of it is to do with input, or some of it is at least to do with inputs. Do you have a D&I policy? You're not actually measuring whether you've got a diverse and an inclusive population or company. You're measuring whether you've got a policy around it. And so a lot of so this comes under governance. Reporting would tend to sit under the G, the governance part, which people think is really boring and they don't pay much attention to. And they think that it will happen as a result of doing everything else. But of course, if you don't have strong governance in place, if you're not holding yourself accountable externally, you can have a policy in place internally within a company and someone else buys that company, which we see here, PE firms buy the company, or somebody leaves and a new CEO comes on board, and it doesn't matter how good your policies around the environment or around the social pillar are, if the governance isn't there, one person can come in and sweep the floor, change everything, decide you're doing something else. You think about what happened in Brazil with their new president coming on board, and all of a sudden deforestation's up 63% so far this year. It doesn't matter how good the existing policies are, someone can wipe the floor with them if the governance isn't there. And so the governance part of it, that's where reporting comes in. The governance part of it is really important, and I would like to see more focus on that, because with good reporting, public accountability, holding yourself to one of the standards, and there are lots of standards, that's really hard. But some of the most the widest definition of sustainability, like GRI, or if you're an investment business, even just looking at PRI is a good step. UN Global Compact, aligning to Sustainable Development Goals, reporting beyond your own remit holds you accountable to a wider set of stakeholders, including the community, and that means it's very difficult to wind back from that. And you can't wipe someone's entire sustainability agenda if they're being held to a more public forum from accountability perspective.
I was hosting a webinar recently where we were talking about private clients adopting sustainable development goals in their investment mandates, and the feedback was that still seems a way off for private clients, or starting to be incorporated. Do you see that as we move forward, clients are going to be using more specific metrics like that? There's more awareness, there's more education available, and more intent to do specific things. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals are interesting because they were originally about nations. It was the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So they were originally put in as things that nations could coalesce around. No poverty. You can get behind that, right? Most people can get behind no poverty, quality education, no social exclusion, all those kinds of things. It's easy to coalesce around. And it was nations targeting those things, and it was supposed to be that all the things you did as a nation to develop, your development of your nation, should have that focus. You should be trying with everything that you did to achieve those things. So you can see how it's trickled down, because I think people look at that and they think, yeah, but I'm on board with that. I want to achieve those things. What can I do to achieve those things? And again, the way that people can think about achieving some of those things, yes, in their day-to-day life they can make different decisions, but actually through their investments is a really good way of focusing on those goals. Sometimes it's easier to describe achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals if you divide them up a little bit. So you can divide them up into the E, S and the G. They fall into the environment, the social, or the governance, but you can also divide them up into 6 sub-themes. And for example, climate preconditions or sustainable resource use, that's sometimes an easier way for people to get to grips with some of this and think about those 6 things in their driving their investment strategy. Sometimes they're thematic, they want to drive one of those. So the real impact investors that we see, and we've got a client that we're dealing with at the moment, they have specifically 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals under one sub-theme that they're really focused on. And if they're narrowing it down in that way, they can specifically have a thematic portfolio that goes out and finds companies that tries to achieve those things. That's really cool. That gets really exciting. But for your average client, even your average private client with a couple of million in a portfolio, that's not as easy to do. So I think starting from the premise that they want to, first of all, do no harm, you've got to know what's going on in your portfolio right now. And this is not a criticism of asset managers, I'll be really clear about this. The asset managers in some ways have their hands tied about the information that they can give because the agencies that provide the ESG data, it's really tightly held. So what they're allowed to do with that data is really restrictive. So they can use it within their business to make investment decisions, but they can't wholesale publish it and give it to their clients. And that is difficult because sometimes, they'll give examples of things that they're doing, but sometimes they can't give the full and total complete picture of everything. And also it's not coming independently. From that perspective, clients often want an independent view that says, okay, this is the actual status of your portfolio. This is where you're currently exposed. And their advisors want something on paper that they can then sit down and say, did you know? Did you know? We were talking about alcohol as a perfect example. So if I had a screening on my portfolio and I saw that it had LVMH, great. Hennessy, Moet, no problem for me. Sit down with another client and they'll say, absolutely not. I want 0 alcohol within my portfolio. Well, you could be saying to the client, okay, do you realise you also own Disney and Hilton? And both of those sell alcohol. It's not what they do. They don't make alcohol, but it is a part of their business model. They do sell alcohol. So some of those clients that would have said no alcohol will say, okay, I'm all right with that. If I don't know, 5% of the revenues or less comes from alcohol, I'm okay with it. Some might say, absolutely not, none, 0. I don't want anything that's got any alcohol in it. Having that data in front of you actually gets you to a position of being able to make that decision and have that discussion. And I think that's the gap previously, is that they just don't have visibility of that information. But I think, coalescing around something is really powerful. Coalescing around sustainable development goals or coalescing around even just triple bottom line reporting, people, planet, profit, having visibility of those 3 things allows people to make a different decision.
Michelle, wonderful to talk to you today. I really look forward to seeing you tonight and then sharing this with our members.